So I'd like to welcome to the channel Scott Britton. This gentleman I met recently when he invited me to have a conversation on his podcast. The podcast is called Evolution FM. Scott is an entrepreneur, and he's also had some interesting experiences along the sort of spiritual spectrum, and we're going to go into all that. But first, I'd like to just give you a chance to say hi and tell us maybe just a little bit about yourself.
Hey, Angelo. Thanks so much for having me on. Big fan of everything that you're putting out in the world. Quick background on me is, I guess professionally, I've mostly worked in the technology industry, where I started a company about 7 years ago called Troops that is now a part of a Salesforce. They bought our company last year, so I work there, which is cool. And I live in Austin, Texas with my fiance, and this exploration of self and reality and all of it is, very emerged as my deepest interest and passion over the past 5 years. And I can't wait to talk more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm totally curious about it. We touched on it very briefly in our previous discussion, but I almost purposely didn't ask any more about it because I wanted to save it for this. So I really don't know. So yeah, and we'll go through it in sort of storyline fashion, maybe how it's played out for you. I'm also curious, and maybe we can towards the end talk a little bit about this of like um, how this unfolding for you might play into the entrepreneurial world and how those
Mm.
intersect if they do, and how that this might land for somebody else who has that mindset or has that sort of vocation of being an entrepreneur, and so forth. So, but let's save that for a little bit later. I'm just curious, what got you to the point where you started noticing that this was that important to you,
Mm.
or became spiritually inclined, or whatever.
Yeah. So I can say it started the first kind of spiritual inkling. I grew up in a Christian household. I went to church, but I never really had any true connection with uh, I'll call it the divine, and um, and it was kind of more of an obligation relationship um, that I was doing to, not go to hell. um,
Yeah.
and the first kind of, I would say, more spiritual practice that came into my life. I woke when I was 23. I woke up with a bald spot the size of a quarter on my face, and I had developed alopecia from being so stressed out, trying to basically control everything, be successful. I was working at a tech company. I'd went to Princeton University. I was an athlete there. I've always just kind of been in these hyper competitive environments where everyone is just trying really hard to be the best at everything, and I was no different. And so I was really nervous about losing all my hair at age 23, and thought I might be destined to be lonely and estranged from the world if that happened. So my doctor said, well, one of the things you can do is meditate. And so I downloaded Headspace and did their Take 10 program. And that was really the first kind of, I got in touch with the idea of the stillness and quieting the mind. And I distinctly remember really resisting it because it felt like I could be doing something. And
Mhm.
after 2 weeks, stopped doing it and noticing an immediate difference in my ability to just sense my body when I
Mhm.
stopped doing it. And so I had an on and off relationship with meditation for about 4 or 5 years where I would do it and then I'd say I'm good, and then I would get stressed out again, and then I would do it, and it was kind of just this kind of never-ending cycle. And
Can I ask you a couple questions about what you've said
yeah,
already? Because otherwise I'll forget. So I hope you don't feel
yeah,
like I'm
no,
interrupting, but I tend to do this, or I'm just going to forget. One is the hyper competitive, hyper focused, driven, not always obviously competitive, but it definitely has a competitive component to being in that world. Boy, I'm sure many people watching this are going to be able to relate. And I know, being a physician, I see this a lot. Like, I see it's definitely a quality of physicians, or I don't know what you would call, like, high functioning people. But by high functioning, I simply mean people who have gone through programs or graduate schools and things that just require you to be almost obsessively hardworking. There's a mindset behind that. There's a whole set of not psychiatric, psyche features of the psyche that keep that construct going. It's kind of artificial in a way. It requires you to, quote unquote, push yourself. That is actually really fascinating to me, and it's also fascinating to me that there's a whole function of that, a whole part of that actually keeps us from looking at something deeper, right? There's, like, you often need a disruption, like something, even a health disruption, even if it seems like a small thing to some people, something that just tells you, yeah, this whole way I'm putting life together where I can just control everything, it's just not really real. Like, there's something about it that's completely false. And so, yeah, I'm just curious if we could talk just a bit more about that, like that obsessive pushing yourself, hyper functioning, constantly working, and using that to sort of avoid maybe seeing something deeper in ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is that you continue to run that program until it doesn't work.
Mm.
It's kind of what society tells us is going to make us feel the way we want to feel. And the experience that I have of that is one where you just chase these blips of feeling good, where it's like, oh, you're striving and striving and striving, and you accomplish and you feel good for a moment, and then you kind of go back and, like, all right, now I got to strive and strive and strive. And it kind of is interesting, because while you're in that state, you don't really understand that there's another way. Like, I had no concept of the feeling, of the notion that I could do nothing and feel good about myself. I just didn't even consider that to be a potential. And what I've noticed is, you know, for a while, like, that program worked, like, as within my mental model of, I was achieving, like, I was, quote unquote, like, doing it well, and everything was going well. I went to the best school. I was the captain of my team. I had women in my life. I had the job. I was winning awards. Like, I did everything right.
Yeah.
And so I thought there's this notion that, well, I'm doing everything that I'm supposed to be doing. And you don't even realize that you're kind of in this matrix that's been thrust upon you unconsciously. And
Yep.
yeah, I think what really opened me up to the notion that I was in a matrix was my first psychedelic experience, where I had never really done any drugs. And when I was, I guess that language is something that we can just, we'll just use that. I had drank alcohol, but, like, I had never really done anything else. And I just gotten out of this 3-year relationship, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm flying in my ayahuasca shaman to New York if you want to do a ceremony." And what was so intriguing to me about that was that I had met a lot of entrepreneurs who had tried that substance and said that it meaningfully impacted the way that they saw the world. And there was this notion of lasting change. And so that really was attractive to me. And it was during that experience that I first experienced effectively communion with Source. And what it felt like was I was having a conversation with some presence in my awareness that was not my crazy thoughts. And one of the things that was communicated to me was, "You've been here with me many times, and you'll be here many more. And that was a mind-blowing concept because I had been under the impression that this was my one life. I got to make the most of it. Like that was the script that was driving so much kind of fear-based achievement and maximization. And when that happened, I was like, holy shit, like pressure's off. And I mean, it was the most profound experience of my life to date when that happened. And, you know, that is what really kind of, I would say that how I got there was that by that time I was 30, I looked around and I was like, I've done everything right. And I just am not happy. You know, I follow.
Yeah, it's hugely important to recognize that. And the other thing about this how you said, you know, you were doing the right things, you were achieving in the right way, and functioning in this social matrix. But what's interesting about high achievement specifically is that you are actually quite externally rewarded in the social matrix itself for that. So it's kind of a double binding that the whole thing is false, yes, and you're also doing pretty well in the illusion, and some maybe deep part of you knows that. It's like, yeah, okay, well, I feel a little, you know, I don't know, a little self-doubt here, but I can always achieve the next thing. You know, I know that this will be replaced by the next achievement, and you can just kind of keep doing that. But it's like juggling. You always have to have a ball in the air. Like you can't actually stop. And then there's a fear of stopping. And so life has a way of stopping us, whether it's through an ayahuasca experience, through a shift in identity or tragedy or health issue. And it sounds like a couple of those things sort of lined up for you. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about what you said before was the meditation piece. I think this is a common issue people have initially with meditation, and sometimes it stops them from doing it ongoing. And that is what you said. You sit, and the one thing that seems to bug you about it is, I feel like I should be doing something. I feel like I should just be doing something, right? Like I should be productive, right? It's funny that one little belief often keeps us from just sitting a little longer or more continuously until you really start to intuitively know what it's about. But anyway,
I think that's so true. And I think it's what, you know, it's all kind of the same complex where you have this idea that there's something out there that when you finally get it, you're going to feel the way you want to feel. And, you know, I think, one of the things that I just want to come back to is I think one of the things I noticed in that period of kind of looking around is I started to look at other people and just see this levity that they hadn't achieved all these things. They hadn't, you know, they weren't playing the game as good as I was playing the game, but there was something different about their inner experience. And I could tell by just the way that they encountered life. And that was a big kind of head scratcher that made me feel like, okay, maybe I've been playing the wrong game. And maybe it's less about what I've done and more about who I am that needs to be investigated.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you were meditating. You said you kind of got into you were an on again, off again situation with it.
Yeah.
And then how did things play out?
Things got very interesting. In the kind of ambitious person that I was after that first ayahuasca experience, I was like, wow, this is amazing. I met God, like everything's great. I want to do this every quarter, like typical startup entrepreneur thinking about things and set cadences. And I did another ayahuasca experience 3 months later. And what happened in that experience is that I had my Kundalini awaken. And I was basically shaking with energy shooting through me for about 6 hours straight. And it was incredibly intense. I feel like I probably lost 10 pounds. uh, going through that, and I thought it was just kind of like I shaked during my first ayahuasca experience for a little bit, and it was described to me as purging. But what happened after that was 2 weeks later, I was in meditation and I started to involuntarily spasm and I started to
Mm-hmm.
shake. And that started to happen 5 to 10 times a day, every time my mind was quieted. And I didn't know what the hell was happening to me. And I saw a ton of Western doctors. I went to neurologists. I went to epilepsy specialists, Parkinson's specialists. No one had an answer for me. And I finally got a 36-hour brain study done at NYU Hospital. And they're like, meanwhile, I'm hooked up to the wires and I'm shaking like a Mexican jumping bean. And they're like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like everything looks normal. And I Googled shaking during meditation, and this Quora answer came up about Kundalini um, rising, Kundalini awakening, and I started to read about it, and I was like, "This is me."
Yeah.
Like this is what's going on, and that pushed me to explore um, Eastern traditions, and I started to do, I was like, well, maybe I should go to Kundalini yoga. And I started to go to breath work. And paradoxically, I ended up doing all of these activating practices for the
Mm-hmm.
energy because I didn't know any better when what I needed was to learn how to work with the energy. And
Yeah.
I finally found a teacher haphazardly through a coworker who was the first person that was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like we need to not do that. And like, no more psychedelics. And like, we need to like settle the energy down. And
Mm-hmm.
she started to have me practice Qigong, which
Yeah.
was very helpful. And she's still my teacher today and has basically shepherded me through the various stages of experience that I've been through since that point in
Nice.
time. I believe we started to work together in January 2019. Um,
Mm. It's funny. I made a video about this exact thing today. So there were about 3 or 4 people who had asked about or commented about Kundalini, energetic, experiences with this process over the last few days. And I sat down to make a video today, and that's what came out. So I was talking about exactly this, and I said there are some people who have a lot of this, and you're that person. So interestingly,
I love the
yeah.
synchronicity, and it's been an intense process. Like I have a friend right now who's like going to Kundalini yoga classes, and I'm like, are you sure you want this?
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, last night I woke up in the middle of the night and I was shaking for 30 minutes. And what I've come to know, my interpretation of it is that, there is just a vast accumulation of unacknowledged emotions and thought forms that are in my subconscious that just continually need to be experienced and transmuted, and it just keeps coming. Like there's
Yeah.
just like a it's like that I've been doing this for 4 years, and it just
Mm-hmm.
keeps coming. And but the thing that's really interesting about the experience is it goes from an inconvenience to actually something that's very enjoyable and rewarding and
Yeah.
fascinating, because there's this your 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 experience of reality and life and what and who you are changes as the more that you do this. And so with more revelation, you just want to keep going. And
Yeah.
it's the adventure of a lifetime.
Absolutely. I mean, the truth of it is, this is all really energetic. So, the whole awakening process and the unbinding process, it's an energetic process, but our identity is so tied into mind, we don't notice that at first. But the more you wake up, the more you realize like energy management and attuning to energy and all of that. It becomes very important, and people figure it out in different ways. Sometimes they
Mm.
intuit their way through it. Other times they get help, and some people have a lot of it, like you. And so It's very direct, very physical, but it's also sort of intelligent. You can feel it, you start to understand it the way it feels. And for me, it's interesting that we're talking about this because, like, I can tell where people are by the way they move. It's not. It doesn't matter what people say. What they say, it sounds like thoughts to me, but it's the way people move, and even animals. So, if you think about how, as you mentioned, how much of this unbinding of identity there is, and how much energetic component there is to that. If you compare a human to like an animal, like I watch dogs, and animals know how to do this. They get up and they shake and they
Mm-hmm.
stretch and they move on to the next thing. But also, animals spend most of their day being very natural in their environment. Humans spend most of their day being
Mm.
unnatural. With the way we communicate with others, the way we constantly modulate, the way we move physically, reacting to other humans. Like we have massive amounts of control built into our identities, even at the behavioral level. We need a lot of energy management, and the more we wake up, the more that becomes important. And obviously, all this very much through experience.
Yeah, it's been,
Yeah.
there's been some really, fascinating things that just with the body that you don't even, that you go through. Like one thing that's interesting that happened to me recently is that my dimples came back. And
Mm.
when I was a kid, I had dimples, big dimples. And then like at some point they just went away. And
Mm.
as I've kind of done lots of just learning to kind of somatically allow things to move, it's like there was so much unconscious tightness in my jaw and my face and the way that I expressed. Same with my stomach. It's like I was sucking in my stomach for, I don't know, decades and had no idea.
Mm.
Like so many things about my posture and even like the laugh. Like I lost my laugh
Mm.
at one point, and it was just
Yeah.
like all of these different parts of the body were constrained in a way that I was just not even aware of.
Mm.
And as you kind of do this work, it just really just kind of all starts to open and go into a more natural state of ease.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's this is a bit of an aside, but the retreat I did most recently, like a home retreat, which is a small retreat, I did something I had done before, but it was just the group of people it really worked well with. And we do this thing called intuitive movement, where we just say, hey, instead of moving in the prescribed ways by the social, matrix that we've learned and stuff, like really let your body just move how it wants to.
Ooh,
Like
yeah.
put your attention in the body and just go from there. And it was really fascinating how it happened, where, people start vocalizing and moving in these ways, but it starts to have its own intelligence. Like you can feel it, and the whole group is sort of moving a certain way, even though we're not necessarily interacting with one another. And it was really interesting. It was cathartic in a lot of ways. You could feel emotion being released, and laughter, and like intense emotion, and grief and things. But it's really fascinating just as an experiment to see what happens when you really give your body permission to just move completely naturally, however it wants to move, even though we've been socially conditioned to not do that. And you start having these flashbacks of when you're a kid, people telling you, quit twitching around,
Yeah.
quit moving, quit moving this way and that way. Like you're taught at a very young age to have quite a restricted range of movement and behavior. And to feel that unwind in your body as an adult is really a trip, actually. It's
It
really cool.
really is. And like, in the uh, somatic experiences that I have, which are quite frequent, that happens all the time where it's like I'm just an observer of like the arm like doing some crazy thing. And what's so fascinating is a lot of times there's a visual imprint that comes up associated with that. Um,
Mm.
where it's like, oh, like my leg is going crazy, and like, sometime when I got hit in football will come into
Mm.
my awareness, and it's like these incomplete impulses that never had the opportunity to finish are completing when the
Yeah.
nervous system is in a state of calm. So it's really,
Mm.
really a far out experience when it
Mm.
first starts happening. But like all things, after a while, it's like, yeah, it's just like a normal part of life.
Yeah. Yeah. You totally get used to it, and feels like part of you. Um, So then what happened?
Yeah, I think so. There was all this kind of Kundalini and somatic stuff. I think that there was definitely a point in time where there was I remember after the ayahuasca experience, I got into Sam Harris and he was talking about this observer thing and the thoughts and the observer. And like, I kind of got it, but didn't really get it. And yeah, it was just like one day I woke up and I was meditating and I was like, wait a second. Well, it's like, if there's the thoughts and then there's me, like, who's the one watching the thoughts? Like, it just clicked. It just clicked. I was like, wait, oh, shit. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
That's who I am. And so that was a really cool experience. And that kind of just, I mean, that it kind of stayed, and stabilized. But what I began to, my practice basically that I was guided to my teacher became essentially to understand when I was triggered and essentially
Mm-hmm.
moved out of that state. And so I became a student of identifying when my patterns got hit, and identifying when I was disturbed by anything in life. And I would go through this process of like quieting the mind, feeling into the experience, like looking at the thought form as like an imprint, and feeling the energy behind it, which was for me like I had become so sensitive, I could really feel everything. And then allowing that energy to kind of relaxing into it, gradually softening, I would feel it move through me, usually to the crown. And then replacing, at first there was an intentional replacement, like, okay, I'll replace this anger with love. And eventually the replacement started to just be more emergent. Like it was like
Yeah.
I didn't need to think about it. It's just like, oh, you're feeling doubt. It's like trust just comes in. Like it just, there's this
Mm-hmm.
notion of kind of the open heart qualities of the natural essence of your true identity that start to become more obvious and then eventually more dominant. And,
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing that for years. And I think as that's happened, I've just completely, just how I show up in the world has completely changed. I don't really get pissed. If I do, it's like, I don't project it. It's like, oh, there's anger. Like, that's funny. Um, and, uh, and yeah, I actually, like, I think one of the things I've realized is like, there's a big difference between being a nice person and being a loving person. And I was always a nice person. And then as my heart began to open, I understood what it means to truly love people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a big change. And then I started to have some, I had this experience during COVID where I first glimpsed non-duality, where I was listening to an Alan Watts track, like literally doing work. And it was like everything just stopped. He like said something. He's like, when are you going to realize that like you are God? And it was like all of a sudden, like everything just stopped. And I just had this recognition of basically the experience emanating from me, being part of the experience, but also being part of this experience, but also like being an intimate creator of the experience. And it
Mm-hmm.
was really, really far out and I didn't know what to do. It was like so I mean, I get the chills just thinking about it, but I had to like go sit down, and
Hmm.
it was really cool. And I think like since that point in time, I've had that kind of like non-dual, these like periods of different duration, um, kind of glimpse and then go away and glimpse and go away. But I think for me, my general experience has been one where it's like you have this initial exposure, and then the kind of exposure and durations kind of become more frequent until eventually there's some form of embodiment. And so it was like that for me with witness consciousness. I think it's like that me with kind of more broadly identifying as, you know, everything I see. And and the other thing that's been really fun is I think kind of one of the ways that the awakening process kind of starts to have like some ahas is like just the amount of synchronicity in your life is just, I mean, it's just undeniable. It's just crazy. And so
It is.
you're like, I mean, how could you start to have all these things happen where you're like, how is this possible? Like where my inner thought so directly matches the outer experience. Um, and you start to become aware of like, wait a second, like I'm creating this. Like I have more authorship than I thought I realized. And the paradox of it all is like, you don't really care. You know, like there was like this, like, there was that phase of like using spirituality to get stuff that I think is just part of the natural continuum for a lot of people. They're like super into manifesting and super into like all these different ways to like kind of get special abilities to manipulate form. And yeah, I think, you know, don't get me wrong, nice stuff is cool. But it just is so not important.
Yeah.
And I think like my experience now is like, so I'm kind of, I went through all this while running a startup, uh, which was like very confusing and very hard and intense. And, you know, I didn't really have a ton of people to talk about it in my normal life. But yeah, I think kind of like what's really cool now is I kind of just wake up and I the predominant whispers in my awareness are not thoughts. They're just directives that come from source. And so I kind of just feel like I'm an order taker almost. Like I just like, it's like, hey, go for a walk. Hey, do this. Hey, do that. Up, don't eat that. Like, and it's just like, I don't need to make any decisions. I don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
And it's the most freeing thing. And there's just this trust that's like
Yeah.
so beautiful that
Hmm.
you know, coming from the place that I was where I thought I needed to figure everything out, you know, I don't need to figure anything out. Like who is there to figure out? Like it's just
Yeah.
kind of like it's just such a, it's so profound that there's not even a word to describe. There's no way to even compare the two. And so yeah, it's been just the gift of a lifetime to move from, you know, the ultra controlling state to one that's more spontaneous, alive, and frankly, just, you know, you just experience awe more. You just experience
Yeah.
wonder. It's like you kind of like go back to what I imagine you felt like when you were a kid before you had just like programming take over everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple things I wanted to reflect on what you just said. So the difference, going back to the beginning of what you were talking about with the shift in consciousness, the difference between that shift in consciousness, which is a fundamental change in what you take yourself to be, for sure, it's a big shift. It's a big relief in a sense. It's a shift. You know, you called it, I think, the witness consciousness. But the difference between that and non-dual realization is an order of magnitude, and it's the implications are far more far-reaching. In that, at first you have a shift in what you take yourself to be, and that's necessary. But when non-dual realization starts to come online, it's like everything changes. Like the reality changes. The way the world and separation and all that is perceived just goes out the window. And then things get quite paradoxical, actually. And you described it well. Whereas before, we feel like we have to be in control. We have to do the right thing. We have to make all these decisions and everything. You know, our whole, you know, life and happiness and all of it really hinges upon everything we do and choose. And we push ourselves and we work hard. And we feel like we have so much control in one sense, or maybe we fear seeing that we don't. But it's all about control. And the funny thing is, when you're in that state, you're actually not in control of anything. You're being completely run by conditioning.
Right.
And then paradoxically, when that falls away, it's hard to talk about how things happen, how they manifest, or how they unfold, but it is very spontaneous. It's quite spontaneous. Like there's nothing apart from anything else to act against anything. So everything's happening simultaneously, synchronistically, and perfectly, actually. And so there's a relaxation there. And yet creativity is totally unblocked now,
That's right.
or unblocks more and more to where it's like, wow, I couldn't have done that when I was thinking so much. And yet somehow it feels like the whole environment just made a choice, right? Life comes forward and just does like this ingenious stuff, you know, and it doesn't have to be for my agenda, but it's quite amazing. And you feel it, and you feel it not just in yourself and your mind, and it's the whole environment doing this. And that's a hard thing to explain because language doesn't even, like, can't really address that. But non-duality, the realization of non-duality starts to clarify that that's actually what's happening. This self-responsive environment, which has no boundaries, you know, there's nothing apart from this at all. No inner, no outer, and it's just coming forward doing what it's doing. But it has a sense of rightness to it. It has a sense of okayness to it. And you could say at the personal level, you could call that trust. But it's deeply okay and profoundly creative and really enjoyable. And you're also just a participant. You know, it's like you just go along for the ride. And you said all this very well.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool. And I think one of the magical things, and I still, you know, I still drop out of that. Like I still have work. I still have inner patterns and things that I'm working on integrating. And, you know, the ego is so freaking clever. It's crazy. And so, but, you know, it feels, it just, everything feels so much different now. And, one of the really magical parts of the experience is that when things, there's a period where everything that's seemingly inconvenient is contextualized as almost this kind of responsive reality that's there to like wake you up. You know, it's there to show you what's left. And when you reach that point, it's kind of like everything has meaning, and you almost feel like a detective. You know, I still feel that way. But I feel like I'm kind of getting into a phase that's like a little bit more relaxed. Versus there was, you know, I definitely had there was a lot of really, really tough days and weeks and months in between, you know, where I was before and where I am now. And I feels like I'm kind of on the a little bit more of a downhill slope than, you know, climbing Everest.
You know, I was going to say also for anyone watching this that it is a pattern I've noticed that for some people going through this, especially once you've had some shift in identity, there's this sort of like, you're going to engage the shadow work sooner or later. You know, you got to do it. It'll happen one way or another. the emotion in shadow work. But I think for some people, I don't know why, they almost for a while can really push that away. They can kind of like even say outright you don't have to do it. Like there's some spiritual tropes out there and ways of speaking where it's like, oh, you don't have to do any of that. There's no one to do it and all this. And it's like, well, it'll come knock on your door sooner or later. But there's for some reason some people can kind of like almost choose whether to do it or not and all this. But people like you who have that intense energetic aspect to this, you kind of don't
You
have a
don't have a
choice.
choice.
Actually, that the energetics of it are really pulling you through this, and so your lesson, just like everyone's lesson, but most importantly for someone who goes through this in a very energetic way, is do not resist this. And that's the beauty of like Mama Ayahuasca. She shows you exactly what what it means to not resist. Like how to surrender again and again and again. But the truth of surrender becomes very obvious to you very quickly, and even a little bit of resistance becomes very, very painful. But yeah, you're led through this like without a choice,
Totally.
and you have to really just be willing to show up even when you don't know how to.
Yeah, it's so true. It's like people ask me, it's like, well, how did you get into this? I'm like, I didn't have a damn choice. Like, it was
Yeah.
the only, and it's, I mean, I'm still dealing with the energy, and so it's kind of like the only way is through.
Hmm.
There's no putting it off. There's no going back, and I'm actually really happy you brought that up around. Because you'll see these random wisdom teachings where it's like, yeah, you just all that other stuff you don't have to do. And as someone who's like at one point was obsessed with shadow work, which was really the ego at play again, um, was like, I wonder if there's actually just a program that I need to do shadow work. Um, and that's actually driving all of this. But it's cool to hear your perspective that, no, actually it is part of the process. You can't really skirt around it.
Yeah, there's a balance to it for sure. It can become an obsession. It can become a thing to do the work all the time, and you got to look at what's really happening. And sometimes when people overly identify with that, they tend to project it onto others, and there can be some kind of weird enmeshment stuff going on. Like look at their students, look at them, look at how they're interacting with people around them. Just the basic litmus test of like, are you a total, you know, jerk, but you're acting like you're not? Like, are you passive aggressive? Like things like that are important. Like look at what's going on around an individual, and usually can pick this stuff up. But I've never seen anybody who's gone through this process who's deeply realized, who I would consider liberated, who hasn't gone through some very, very intense shadow stuff. Like I have not seen that not happen. I've seen people who don't talk about it, but if I know them, usually I know that it does happen behind the scenes. They just don't want to, they don't want to give this process a bad name. So I think some people don't highlight it so
Yeah.
much, but there's usually intense pain, intense emotional stuff, energetic stuff, a lot of resistance patterns you have to come into contact with. Um, and none of that's new. I mean, none of that is created by the spiritual process. It's been there a long time. It's just conveniently, as you said, the ego is insidious. It's conveniently swept under the rug again and again by the way the ego functions. It's amazing. The ego is a true magician, that it can really like repress so much pain and unconsciousness in us, and we really don't know it's there. I mean, you really are kind of innocent even when you're toxic,
It,
because you don't realize it. Once you start to wake up, though, the cost for going unconscious gets higher and higher. You just can't afford it anymore, and you can't do it in good conscience to yourself or anyone else around you. And so then you're kind of led through the shadow stuff. If there's no shadow, you don't need to wake up. You're already enlightened. But I've never met anybody who's naturally enlightened. So
yeah. Yeah. No, it's so many good points. And, it's funny. It's like you kind of just, I'm having more and more friends kind of have this experience. And, there was a lot of people, like a lot of my context is that ultra ambitious tech person did that, didn't work. Now they're doing the spirituality and they're applying the same ideas to spirituality, but they don't know they're doing it. And I was that
Mhm.
person where it was like,
Yeah.
you know, I'm going to fucking meditate like X hours a day, and I'm going to read spiritual books, and I'm going to constantly listen to a spiritual podcast. I'm going to be doing everything spiritual. I'm going to be a vegan. I'm going to go harder at this than everyone. And like, I think in all these things, it's like, there's a time where that actually will serve you until it doesn't. And you'll
Yeah.
just see that as another attachment, and, and taking a different form. And, you
Yeah.
just,
And sometimes I might tell someone like that, like, be careful what you set yourself up for. Like
oh,
you'll open a lot of doors you may not be ready to open. Like, you know, so it'll take care of itself one way or another. But
you're totally right. I think I was the person who overextended themselves energetically. And it's not that, I don't think it's anything to be afraid of, but it just means you're going to be uncomfortable when you do that at some point, because
more than you
more than you
realize.
realize, because you have so much processing. And then for me, like one of the big things for me was I was so out of sorts that there were many days where I couldn't work. I would just be like, I
Mhm.
didn't sleep the night before. I had so much energy in my head. It was like, I felt like I was plugged into an electric socket. And then I would just sit on the couch all day and not be able to do all the things that previously made me feel good. And I remember sitting on the couch one day and going, God, I can't do anything. I feel worthless. And that was a huge unlock for me, because I was like, oh my God, like I was doing all of these things because I felt like there was a deep seated program, ego component that felt like it had no worth.
Yeah.
And that was what this whole existence was about, was invalidating that. And
Yeah.
that was a very holy shit moment. uh,
The interesting thing about that is I find that in literally everybody at some point in this process. Everyone I've seen go through this will come into contact with that very profound, deep seated sense of unworthiness. It's not, and it's nothing it feels so personal. It feels hyper personal, but it's actually not personal at all. It's an ingenious part of the whole program running that keeps it repressed, keeps it feeling so personal you don't want to look at it. Call it shame, call it even sometimes self hatred. It just gets so pushed down, but everyone will come into contact with that sooner or later. And it's very surprising, especially again, if you're like really high functioning and an achiever, it's very surprising that all of that was a reaction formation to avoid this. It's like, really?
totally.
What the
Yeah.
hell?
Because
Like, really? That's what I've been doing all this time? Like, why I felt like just been burning my energy up so much. Like, sure, I've been achieving outwardly, and that's been an effect of it, but there's so much like grinding gears and energy, like wasted and all self doubt and all this that I didn't even know was there. And all of a sudden, it can stop, and you're like, wow, I can still do all this stuff, but it's kind of effortless. It's not hard. What's hard is me struggling against myself. That's what's hard. That's the only thing that's hard is our own internal struggle, really. But you got to get deep to see that, right? Otherwise, you'll just burn through yourself all your whole life and not realize how much resistance is there.
totally. I had a really cool story that kind of just, I think, personifies this in such a unique way. I had a friend who, very similar trajectory, tech entrepreneur, kind of got on this path about 2, 3 years ago, and he ran a Spartan race um, 3 years ago. And he did this like hardcore training regimen. I don't know if you know who David Goggins is, but he's like some
Yeah, yeah.
author who's like,
Mhm.
he runs like 130 miles at a time, just this crazy military guy, ex-military guy. And he did that whole training regimen. And then this time, he's kind of just living in flow. He didn't really train much at all. And he sent me a text, and he got the same exact time in the race. And it was just like it was the most hilarious thing, because
Yeah.
it was like, wow, all that efforting, huh? Guess that was kind of unnecessary. What a
There's
cosmic
there's
joke
a
there.
I was going to say, there's a cosmic joke at the center of all of this. There's a jester like operating in all of this, and it's not funny when you're suffering, but like Voltaire's quote, God is a comedian whose audience is too afraid to laugh. There's something really, really funny going on here with all of it, with the whole identity thing, with the whole, and if you're just open enough and humble enough and vulnerable enough, you'll have your release. You know what I mean? You'll have your moments of just being able to just hold your gut laughing, and not taking yourself so seriously. And so much of this is really just about a certain kind of like natural humility once you get rid of all these absurd ideas about yourself, and that we all have.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So it's part of the fun,
Yeah.
Part of the fun is to have those moments and just, you just take a deep breath and you're just like, fuck. That was a good one.
So what would you tell an entrepreneur? You've already been sort of saying this, but what would you tell somebody who's starting out as an entrepreneur and they also have this inclination to investigate what we're talking about?
Part of this is what I feel, I don't know if calling is the right word, but I just feel very positioned in the world to kind of be a bridge between people that are on this path and then that are in the business world. And I think one of the big things that I see is that people believe there's an incompatibility with prioritization of the inner experience and that expressing in a way outwardly that society calls successful. It's almost like, oh, well, I don't want to lose my edge. Like that, like kind of idea comes up a lot. And the really interesting thing that I've talked about a fair amount is like, I've never been more successful. It's like since I started to really open up, and how that is coming through is different. Like the context is different. The context is like creative ideas are just constantly coming into my awareness. Things just come together easily. It's just so different from like the striving, the pushing, the like elbowing your way to try to make things happen. And I just think like for all those entrepreneurs out there, like that are listening to this or people in business, you don't have to give up any of those things. Just know that there is another way to get the same things in the external world that you want that frankly just is a lot more fun and has a lot nicer texture. And I personally think it's the best investment you can make, like for external success. And I just launched a course on this that I just am kind of putting out in the world about intuition and learning to kind of almost treat that like a skill and experimentation process, like the learning to trust the inner voice and the inner guidance and kind of incorporate that versus just purely logical mind thinking. Because, I just want more people out there to kind of start operating, head and heart, not just head in business.
Yeah.
And I just think the people will be surprised how well things go.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with pretty much everything you just said. I want to reflect back and make a distinction about a couple things, and you can tell me what you think about it. One is, when you speak about somebody who has this inclination, I would say they're probably already, I don't know about wired that way, but they already know this about themselves. They're interested in business. They're interested in entrepreneurship. It's their passion. It's something that feels like where they want to put a lot of their energy in the relative world. So to that person, I would say, I agree that that motivation, that instinct to create business, to engage in the challenges of business and so forth, and creating business and whatever area, industry you're interested in, all that, there's nothing incompatible about that from spirituality or awakening. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people might even be surprised hearing me say, but I think a lot of people would disagree with. Like there's old, old school mindsets about equating spirituality to monasticism, to non-materialism, to like literally owning nothing and stuff. And I think a lot of times people will judge messages or people based on this stuff, but they themselves are also living in the matrix we all live in of abundance and materialism and stuff. But genuinely, at the deepest level, I can say I've not seen anything that would make an issue of compatibility with functioning in business, functioning in medicine, having a job, having a vocation, being incompatible with realization. The ticket to ride for realization is you're fully committed to it. That's right. It. And so that leads to the second thing I want to say is that while I do agree with you that somebody who's an entrepreneur is interested in what we're talking about, but what I would say is they should be genuinely interested in what we're talking about. They shouldn't hear what we're saying and go, oh, I think I want to go do some ayahuasca because it might make my business work better, but I'm kind of not really that interested in spirituality. Like, I'm not sure I would definitely push somebody towards that. Now, if they instinctually really are interested, they're fine. They're going to be fine. And there are going to be times when they're hard to put those together. Maybe, like you said, there'll be times when you don't feel like working right now. You're just, your mindset, you're just not there. But that can happen to anybody. But I do think they're going to be okay. And whatever vocation you find yourself in, whatever field you find yourself in, you're fine. You don't need to get rid of that or stop doing that so that you can wake up. That's the ego actually sneaking in there and tricking you, right? It's conveniently wedging itself in there to say, well, maybe once you abandon your need for a career and money, then you can wake up. No, that's not how this works. You wake up where you are and you wake up how you are. And then the last thing I would say is things can change for you, though. I will say, the way your life looks and what you're interested in may change mostly if what you're actually looking for is a surrogate. So if you're interested in business and entrepreneurship because you just want to be rich and you don't see that, and it's like really based in competitiveness and stuff like that, that may be uncovered for you, and you may be surprised what your actual motivations are. Now, again, there are people who are genuinely interested in business. That's their skill set. That's their interest in life. Nothing wrong with that. But again, if it's for a surrogate, something, and I would say this to someone going into medicine as well. If you've been pushed into medicine by your parents, and yeah, logically you can tell yourself, well, I'll have a good job. I'll be a physician. I'll help people. I'll make money. I'll be able to raise a family. But if your heart's really not in it and you're looking for a surrogate, like pleasing your parents or money, you may be disillusioned and disappointed. And sometimes the awakening process can accelerate that process. But I think it would have probably happened anyway. Same thing goes with relationships. I tell people, I can't guarantee that this won't blow up your relationship. It might. But if your relationship is based in mutual trust and mutual love and you support each other growing and changing, there's no reason this will necessarily cause a relationship to end. So I always put those caveats on that there's no guarantees here, and you can't use spirituality to get things you think you want because you may be surprised what you even want.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It's like,
Yeah.
you have an identity shift. Like there probably going to be some shit that, goes out with that. But, to that, I would just respond like, don't you want to know? Like, don't you want to be more close to your authentic essence? And, I can say a lot of things I used to care about have fallen by the wayside, but like, man, I'm fucking happy about it. Cause you don't regret something. There's a period of the loosening of the grip and of the attachment that's like really, really hard. And there's this like kind of going back and forth where you're trying to hold on. But, for me, I had this with a lot of things, but on the other side of that, you're like, wow, I'm so grateful. I'm so happy that I don't obsess over, money or women or like whatever you use to prop up the false self. It's just my own experience.
Yeah, I'm 100% on the same page with you on that point. Like, don't you want to know this? Don't you want to be in connection with this truth? For me, 100%. I don't care if everything outwardly in my life dissolves, this body mind dies away, that I'll go there to wake up. That was my motivation, and it's been my whole life. I've actually had to learn a little bit the opposite, that like just because I want that doesn't
Yeah.
mean everybody does. So because then you can impose it on others. So I've really learned to like feel into where people are when I talk about this, and I try not to impose any kind of like moral imperative, like you really should wake up to your true nature, because I don't believe that. You should wake up to your true nature when you're ready to wake up to your true nature, and trust yourself to like feel into that. But you and I are on the same page.
Did
Yeah, of course. Like this is the only kind of conversation I'm really interested in.
totally. Did you do you think people have a choice in this experience? Like,
Well, then there's that. So like there's no I don't really experience things in the sense that there's choice. But but to the degree that you feel like a separate person, you feel like a separate seeking individual apart from everything making choices, this kind of communication actually has an effect on that person. So they can sort of, you know, I don't know, feel into this, and that will affect their experience of, you know, it's like the example would be, did you have a choice of whether you learn to meditate or not? Well, no, but talking about meditation, making sure it's out there, getting it out into the world, dramatically increases the chances that people will, by no choice of their own, bump into it. You know, so everything we do matters in one sense. When we talk about this, it matters. It has effects. But in the grand scheme, in my direct experience, there's no choice about anything.
yeah. Yeah, I think like I was kind of, you know, kind of hinting at like karma as a concept, and, you know, whether you believe in that, and people, oh, this lifetime, is there finally your turn, you know, or whatever,
Hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
notion. I actually
I think
don't know.
there is karmic there I think there is karmic threads that affect all of this. And but karma to me is experienced in the relative only. This kind of cause and effect and causality, that's the relative world. Um, and for me, the deeper this has gone, the more obvious it becomes that how relative and absolute are not two things, and I can experience them simultaneously. So it's like I can function in the relative and in the absolute and communicate in both, and I can switch back and forth all the time to various degrees depending on what's needed, or what you're called upon to come forth with. And so in the relative world, there's no reason to ignore the rules of the relative world, which are causality essentially, which is karma. Um, and there's also a part of reality that doesn't even have anything to do with it all. There's just literally nothing. There's no form, no beginning, no end. Nothing's ever happened. Nothing's ever moved. Nothing ever will move, and nothing ever has to move. So things go into a very strange place with this. But as Adyashanti said, this is like my favorite quote by him. I think is, when you really see what your true nature is, all of physical reality, the universe itself could completely disappear, and your true nature wouldn't even notice.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, you know, my spiritual teacher once said, and I don't know if somebody else said this and she was just ripping it off, but she's like, why would the ocean go look for a cup of water? You know,
Right?
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, point taken, point taken. One question
Exactly.
I had for you was, you mentioned you work a lot with people on integrating when they have these experiences, and that process. What do you see as being kind of like the most important considerations or things that people, you know, need help with or need to be aware of?
Yeah, I would say that most of that is one version or another of acceptance of this process and not resisting it. So it depends on the person. Some people overtly and abjectly reject that this is happening, and it's really a bad idea. Like some of the most uncomfortable, dysphoric people I've ever met in my life are people who, for whom this awakening process is definitely unfolding, and they're saying no to it, like literally, like no. And I don't want it to happen. I want to go back into my dream world of thoughts. Like that's a really bad idea, and it creates untold misery in those people. That's a small subgroup of people, but I've seen it. So with someone like that, it's just like, you have to learn that this life is not going to go the way you thought it was going to go. You just have to learn that. You can't imagine reality into being anymore. It never happened, and it never will happen. This story in your mind is nothing but a thought. You have to accept that. No, I won't. That's the thing where it's just like you're fighting the most powerful force you're ever going to come into contact with. I don't recommend it. Now that's in a really gross way of just resistance and acceptance, but it comes to subtler and subtler levels of acceptance, of thoroughly accepting that we really don't have control. That right now, if I'm feeling existential fear, if right now I'm feeling shame, that needs as much of my attention as I can give it. That's a simple way of saying it. And you always learn. Everyone learns this. You're learning it, and you've learned it. Like, you just realize that when we're mind identified, we can distract so easily that you don't even notice that there's a little shame there, and all of a sudden you're off on a tangent. It could be an addiction, it could be overworking, it could be anything, right? But the identified mind is just awash with distraction. It's nothing but distraction. So it's very difficult to integrate anything there. But once you have a shift in identity, you have a lot more awareness available to actually just experience what's happening. And then it's a matter of accepting the fact that, there's actually a lot here. There's a lot of material that's going to come to the surface that I may not want to feel, but it's there, and I might as well acknowledge it, and then I might as well feel it. And then you learn to penetrate it energetically. You learn to go right into it, and you want to go right into it. Whatever's there, whatever, even the really subtle stuff, it's like, that's where my attention wants to go immediately. Because realization is nothing more than clear seeing, ultimately. You're not getting rid of anything. You're not gaining anything. You're not becoming something you weren't. It's none of that. That's just the mind's version of it. It's about clear seeing and its full embodiment energetically. So it really comes down, integration comes down to acceptance, but it's customizable depending on where people are fixating. And people will fixate in various areas. Some people are going to fixate in the masculine. They're going to fixate in the feminine. They're going to fixate in thought sometimes. Sometimes they're going to fixate in emotion. So those are all versions of control. And ultimately, this is about surrender.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, I was writing something, and it was around this idea of, like, what does prioritization of this path really look like? And for me, as someone who's a knowledge worker, who's in front of their computer, who's on Zoom calls, it's kind of exactly what you said. It's like, I could have this whole plan of, like, oh, I'm going to work on my book, or I'm going to write something. And then it's like, you feel a weird sensation, and you're like, oh, got to go deal with that. And then, like, an hour and a half later, it's like, okay, I'm back now. I just learned 5 new things about myself that I didn't know existed. And okay. And that's kind of what it looks like, and the funny thing is that it doesn't even feel like an obligation at a certain point, where you're, like, genuinely excited to do that. And it's like the just obvious thing to do, relative to doing your to-do list, or whatever was, had you were focused on prior.
I totally agree with that. And I don't make a lot of to-do lists. I keep things on a schedule, or I'll forget them. But I have a vague idea of, like, on a certain project, like, where that's going and what my time frame is on it. But I don't overthink it at all. It's just like, I have a sense of it, and that's it. And if it happens, it does. If it doesn't, But what I realized is, overthinking it is never what made it happen or not happen anyway. That's what, if anything, prevented it from happening, or made it feel effortful when it didn't need to be. So my experience is very much like what you just described. It's by the time you even notice something happening, it's already in the past, in a sense. By the time the mind gets a hold of it, it's just full immersion. So whatever's happening, the ultimate lesson with all of this is just saying yes to it. Is like, okay, this is what's happening right now. This is what life's showing me. I have reverence for whatever this is. I have total reverence for it. So if it wants to show me something in terms of someone acting angrily towards me, then I'm like, okay, this is what I need to see right now, and I want to see as deeply as possible into it for my benefit, for their benefit, for everyone's benefit, and just because I don't want to say no, and so it just becomes about saying yes, 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 ultimately.
Yeah. Easier said
Yeah,
than done.
that is for sure.
But definitely, yeah, definitely the only option you have at a certain point.
It's
Not
true.
really given a
Yeah.
choice.
All right, my friend. Well, that was a great conversation, and I'm sure we'll have one in the future as well.
Awesome. Yeah, this was a blast, man. Really fun.
Yeah.
Like you, don't really know what else is more interesting than this.
Yep.
So love these conversations and love your channel and all the things that you're putting out into the world.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I appreciate your time and all your effort and the work you've done and continue to do. It's not like anyone's patting you on the back for it, but it makes a difference. Absolutely makes a difference. So
Thank you.
thanks again, man. It's been fun, and let us know. Okay, do you have any aside from your Evolution FM podcast that anyone can find on the regular podcast channels? What else do you want to?
I got a Substack. So if you just search my name, Scott Britton, do a fair amount of writing there, and also link to like the podcast and different things that I'm creating. So yeah, find me on Substack, and would
Perfect.
love to stay in touch with anybody.
Great. Yeah, we'll put some links under this video too for anyone who's interested.
Cool. Well, thanks again, man.
Right on, man.